Tonight, this story begins very quietly. There is no need to hurry. Wherever the listener happens to be, the room can remain dark, the lights can remain low, and the world outside can simply continue without needing anything from them for a little while. Perhaps the day has been long. Perhaps there has been work, noise, traffic, messages, responsibilities, and all the small things that fill an ordinary day. And now, for a little while, there is nothing that needs to be solved. This is simply a story. A very old story. A story about a city that grew into an empire. A story about roads that crossed mountains and deserts. About ships moving slowly across the Mediterranean. About soldiers walking beneath red and purple standards. And about ordinary people living their lives beneath a government that seemed, for a very long time, almost impossible to imagine disappearing. Tonight, the journey goes back nearly 2,000 years. It travels through the Roman world, through its greatest moments, through its wealth and its cities, through its emperors, its armies, its borders, and its quiet countryside, and then, slowly, through the problems that began to gather beneath the surface. The Roman Empire did not simply wake up one morning and discover that it was gone. Its ending was much slower than that. It happened over generations. Some people living through it probably did not even realize that they were living during the final chapters. For them, there were still markets, there were still farms, there were still churches, there were still ships in the Mediterranean, there were still Roman laws, there were still roads, children were still born, people still married, workers still went to their jobs, and families still sat down to eat in the evening. That is one of the quiet mysteries of history. An empire can be changing forever while ordinary life continues almost as if nothing has happened. So tonight, there is no need to imagine Rome as one enormous dramatic event. Instead, Rome can be imagined as a long evening, a very long evening. The sun once stood high above the empire. Then, almost too slowly to notice, it began to move toward the horizon. And this is the story of that movement. So let the story begin. For centuries, Rome was one of the greatest political and cultural creations the ancient world had ever seen. At its height, the Roman Empire stretched across much of Europe, across North Africa, and deep into the Middle East. It surrounded the Mediterranean Sea so completely that Roman writers sometimes thought of that sea almost as an inland body of water. They called it Mare Nostrum, our sea. It was an extraordinary idea. A person could travel from Britain to Egypt while remaining inside the same political world. A merchant could move goods from Spain toward Italy. Grain could travel from North Africa toward Rome. Olive oil could travel across the sea. Wine could move from one province to another. Letters could travel along roads. Soldiers could be transferred from distant frontiers, and ideas could move with them. The Roman world was enormous, but it was connected. Roads crossed landscapes that had once seemed impossibly difficult. Bridges carried people over rivers. Aqueducts brought water into cities. Harbours connected distant shores. Large public buildings gave cities a shared appearance. Roman law created systems that would influence European societies for centuries. Latin spread across much of the Western Empire. Greek remained deeply important in the Eastern Mediterranean, and millions of people, from wealthy senators to farmers and labourers, lived within the vast structure of Roman rule. Rome was not perfect. It was often brutal. It relied heavily on slavery. Its wars could be extremely destructive. Political power was frequently violent. Emperors could be cruel, unstable, or simply unlucky. But Rome was also remarkably capable. It could organise. It could build. It could collect taxes, it could move armies, it could absorb foreign peoples, it could lose a province and sometimes return years later to take it back. It could survive emperors who seemed determined to destroy themselves, and perhaps most importantly, it could adapt. That ability would help Rome survive for centuries, but eventually, adaptation became more difficult. The question of why Rome fell has occupied historians for a very long time. There was never one single answer. Some people once blamed moral decline, others emphasized economic problems, others pointed toward political instability. Some focused on the army, others on migration and invasions. Still others argued that Christianity changed Roman society, or that the empire became too large to govern effectively. Modern historians generally see something more complicated. Rome did not fall because of one problem. It faced many problems at the same time. The empire was simply a very large system, and large systems can become fragile. If a road breaks in one place, the problem may be small. If several roads break, taxes become harder to collect. If taxes become harder to collect, armies become harder to pay. If armies become harder to pay, borders become harder to defend. If borders become harder to defend, enemies and migrating peoples can enter. If cities become poorer, fewer resources are available. If political leaders begin fighting one another, even more energy is lost. One problem can make another problem worse, and so decline can become a process rather than a single event. This is important to remember throughout the story. The Roman Empire did not simply become weak. It changed, it divided, it adapted, it lost territory, it recovered territory, it changed its army, it changed its religion, it changed its capital, it changed its language, and eventually, the western half of the empire stopped existing as a Roman imperial state. The eastern half continued for almost another 1,000 years. So when people speak about the fall of Rome, they're really speaking about several different things. The fall of the city of Rome as the center of power, the disappearance of the Western Roman Empire, the transformation of Roman society, and the long transition from the ancient world into the medieval world. There was no single night when antiquity ended. There was only time, and time, slowly, changed everything. The height of Rome. Rome at the height of its power. There was a period when the Roman Empire seemed remarkably secure. The Mediterranean was surrounded by Roman territory. The roads were busy, the cities were prosperous, the army was powerful, and the imperial government was able to maintain an extraordinary degree of order across a vast landscape. This was especially true during the 2nd century. The period is sometimes remembered as one of Rome's most peaceful and stable ages. The empire had reached a size that was enormous, but it was still functioning. The emperor stood at the top of the political system. Below him were governors, administrators, soldiers, local officials, wealthy landowners, merchants, craftsmen, farmers, and countless other people whose daily work kept the empire alive. The emperor could live in a magnificent palace, but the empire did not function because of the emperor alone. It functioned because millions of people participated in it. A farmer in Gaul did not need to think about the entire Roman world. He only needed to grow crops. A potter needed to make pottery. A merchant needed to transport goods. A soldier needed to stand at a frontier. A tax collector needed to collect revenue. A local official needed to maintain order. Each small task formed one piece of the larger system. And when enough pieces worked together, Rome became extraordinarily powerful. The city itself was enormous. Rome contained temples, forums, baths, theatres, markets, apartment buildings, villas, fountains, warehouses, roads, and monuments. Water arrived through aqueducts. Food arrived from distant provinces. The city consumed enormous quantities of grain. Ships carried supplies across the Mediterranean. Some of the grain came from Egypt. Some came from North Africa. The empire's wealth depended heavily on movement. Movement of people, movement of goods, movement of money, movement of information, and above all, movement of armies. The Roman army was one of the most important institutions in the empire. Its soldiers served along frontiers that could be thousands of kilometres apart. There were troops in Britain. There were troops along the Rhine. There were troops along the Danube. There were troops in the Balkans. There were troops in Syria. There were troops in Egypt and North Africa. The army was not simply a force used to conquer. By the 2nd century, much of its role was defensive. Soldiers guarded roads. They protected borders. They built bridges. They maintained forts. They sometimes helped with construction, and they formed a permanent presence in distant regions. The Roman frontier was not always a solid wall. It was often a zone, a river, a road, a chain of forts, a collection of military settlements, a network of patrols. The famous wall in northern Britain was only one part of this much larger system. The empire was not completely sealed off from the outside world. Trade continued across its borders. People crossed them. Foreign soldiers entered Roman service. Merchants travelled beyond them. Diplomats came and went. The Romans were never living in complete isolation. In fact, Rome was constantly interacting with peoples it called barbarians. The word did not necessarily mean that these people were primitive. It was simply a Roman way of describing peoples who lived outside the Roman cultural and political system. Many of them traded with Rome. Some fought Rome. Some served in Roman armies. Some eventually settled inside Roman territory. The boundary between Roman and non-Roman was often much less clear than it appears on a modern map, and that would become very important later. At the height of the empire, Rome could absorb enormous amounts of cultural diversity. People in different provinces spoke different languages. They worshipped different gods. They had different traditions. They ate different foods. They dressed differently. Yet many of them could still think of themselves as part of the Roman world. Roman citizenship gradually became more widespread. In the early empire, citizenship had been a privilege with important legal meaning. Over time, it expanded. Eventually, in the 3rd century, the Emperor Caracalla granted citizenship to nearly all free inhabitants of the empire. This changed the meaning of Roman identity. Being Roman was becoming less about living in the city of Rome and more about belonging to a vast political world. That world could feel surprisingly modern in some ways. There were cities with crowded streets. There were shops. There were restaurants and taverns. There were landlords and tenants. There were craftsmen. There were wealthy families. There were poor families. There were schools. There were courts. There were entertainers. There were religious communities. There were people trying to make money. There were people trying to avoid taxes. There were people trying to find work. There were people simply trying to live. The empire was not a machine. It was a collection of human lives, and human lives are never perfectly stable. Even during the best years, Rome had problems. There was inequality. There was slavery. There was corruption. There were political conspiracies. There were wars. There were diseases. There were bad harvests. There were emperors who made terrible decisions. But the system was strong enough to absorb many of these difficulties for a while. The height of Rome, therefore, makes its later decline especially interesting. Because the empire did not begin as a weak state, it began its final centuries as one of the strongest political structures on earth. That is perhaps one of the quiet lessons of history. Strength is never a promise about the future. A structure can stand for a very long time and still, slowly, change. The first signs of weakness, internal problems, economy, corruption, and distant borders. The Roman Empire had always experienced difficulties. But during the 2nd and 3rd centuries, some problems became more serious. One of the largest problems was political. The Roman imperial system had no simple, peaceful method for choosing a new emperor. There was no modern election. There was no fixed constitutional succession that everyone accepted. An emperor could name an heir. A powerful family could influence the succession. The Senate could support someone. But the army mattered enormously. And when soldiers believed that their commander should become emperor, they could make him emperor. This created a dangerous possibility. An ambitious general with loyal troops could challenge the emperor. If several armies supported different candidates, civil war could begin. Civil war was particularly damaging because it used Roman resources against Romans. Soldiers who might otherwise have guarded the frontier were marching toward other Roman armies. Money that might have been used for infrastructure was spent on military campaigns. Cities could become battlefields. And perhaps most damaging of all, political instability weakened the idea that the emperor represented a stable centre. The empire needed continuity. Instead, it sometimes received competition. Another problem was financial. The Roman government required enormous amounts of money. The army needed to be paid. Roads needed maintenance. Fortifications needed repair. Administrators needed salaries. The imperial court consumed resources. Public buildings required funding. The empire also had to respond to emergencies. When war came, expenses rose. When harvests failed, food prices rose. When emperors tried to satisfy soldiers with larger payments, the treasury could suffer. And there was a deeper problem. The empire was not constantly expanding. During the earlier centuries, conquest had brought new territory. New territory could mean new taxes, new resources, and new people who could be incorporated into the empire. But by the 2nd century, most of the useful conquests had already been made. The empire had reached natural boundaries in many places. There was still expansion at times, but the great age of continuous conquest was fading. The empire now had to maintain what it already possessed. That was expensive. The borders were long, very long. Britain was far from Syria, Spain was far from the Danube, Egypt was far from Gaul. The empire's enormous size was one of its greatest strengths. It was also one of its greatest burdens. Imagine trying to carry a message from one end of that world to the other. Even with excellent roads, it could take weeks. An army could not simply appear wherever it was needed. A crisis on one frontier could leave another frontier exposed. The Romans became increasingly dependent on careful organization. And organization is difficult when political leadership is unstable. Economic problems also began to appear. The Roman economy was based on agriculture. Most people were farmers. Cities depended on food arriving from the countryside. The state depended on taxes collected from agricultural production. When farms were productive, everything worked more easily. When harvests failed, the consequences spread. There were also problems with currency. Roman emperors sometimes reduced the amount of precious metal in coins. The reasons were understandable. The government needed money. But reducing the precious metal content could weaken confidence in the currency. Prices could rise. People could begin preferring older coins with more reliable metal content. The economy did not suddenly collapse. That is important. The Roman economy remained active for centuries. Trade continued, markets continued, agriculture continued, but the system became more strained. There were also increasing pressures on local communities. Taxes could be heavy. Administrators could be corrupt. Local elites sometimes had to carry responsibilities they did not want. In the later empire, the state increasingly tried to make certain occupations hereditary. The goal was stability. If the government needed farmers to remain on the land, it wanted to make sure farms continued producing. If it needed certain workers, it wanted them to remain in their professions. But such policies could make society feel more rigid. The empire was becoming more concerned with holding itself together, and when a society becomes very concerned with holding itself together, it can sometimes become less flexible. There was also the problem of distance. The emperor could not personally supervise everything. Governors had significant power. Military commanders had significant power. Tax officials had significant power. Corruption was not new. But in a large empire, corruption could be difficult to control. A small amount of corruption in one town might not matter much. Repeated across thousands of towns, it could become expensive. Still, none of these problems alone explains the fall. Rome had survived economic problems before. It had survived corrupt officials. It had survived bad emperors. It had survived wars. It had survived epidemics. The real danger came when several problems began happening at the same time, and that moment arrived during the 3rd century. The crisis of the 3rd century. The 3rd century was one of the most difficult periods in Roman history. For several decades, the empire experienced political instability, civil wars, invasions, economic problems, and rapid changes in leadership. It was a time when the Roman world seemed uncertain about its future. The problems began to intensify after the death of the Emperor Severus Alexander in the year 235. He had been killed by his own troops. After that, a period began in which emperors frequently came to power through military support. Many did not remain emperor for long. Some were killed, some were defeated, some died in battle, some were murdered by their own soldiers. The exact number of emperors and rival claimants during this period can make the era feel confusing. But the basic picture is simple. Rome was fighting itself. At the same time, enemies were pressing against the borders. In the east, the Persian Empire under the Sasanian dynasty became a powerful rival. This was not a small neighbouring kingdom. It was a major state with its own armies, cities, traditions and ambitions. The Romans and Persians would spend centuries competing with one another. Meanwhile, Germanic peoples and other groups were putting pressure on the northern frontiers. Roman armies were forced to move from one crisis to another. The empire was not helpless. Roman soldiers continued to win battles. Generals continued to organize defenses. Cities continued to function. But the pressure was becoming intense. One of the most remarkable episodes of this crisis occurred when the empire almost broke apart. For a period in the 3rd century, large sections of the Roman world were controlled by rival governments. In the west, a breakaway state emerged that included Gaul, Britain and parts of Spain. In the east, another breakaway power centred around Palmyra controlled large areas. Rome itself was still the centre of the main imperial government, but the empire had, for a time, become several competing Roman worlds. It was a dangerous moment, and yet Rome recovered. This recovery is important because it shows how resilient the empire could be. The Emperor Aurelian emerged as one of the great restorer figures. He reconquered the breakaway territories. He brought the empire back together. He strengthened Rome's defences. The famous Aurelian walls were built around Rome during his reign. For the first time in centuries, the capital itself received major defensive walls. That fact tells its own quiet story. Rome had once been so confident that its city centre did not require such fortifications. Now the capital was preparing for a more uncertain world. Aurelian was assassinated before he could fully complete his work. But other emperors continued the process. The most important was Diocletian. When Diocletian became emperor in 284, he recognized that the empire had become too difficult for one ruler to manage alone. His solution was radical. He reorganized the government, he reorganized taxation, he reorganized the army, and he created a system of multiple emperors. This became known as the Tetrarchy. The idea was simple. Instead of one emperor trying to control everything, several emperors would govern different regions while still belonging to the same imperial system. There would be senior emperors and junior emperors. Each would have responsibility for a particular region. The empire would remain one political structure, but power would be distributed. It was an attempt to solve the problem of distance. If a crisis appeared near the Rhine, an emperor in the west could respond. If a crisis appeared in the east, another emperor could respond there. The system was not permanent. It eventually broke down. But Diocletian's reforms transformed the empire. The later Roman Empire was increasingly different from the Rome of the 2nd century. The government became larger. The bureaucracy became more complex. The army became larger. Taxes became more organized. The emperor became more distant and ceremonial. The old image of the emperor as a first citizen among Romans slowly gave way to a more openly monarchic style. The empire was changing because it had to survive. There was also another transformation taking place: religion. Christianity, which had begun as a small movement in the Eastern Mediterranean, had gradually spread throughout the empire. For a long time, Christians could face suspicion and persecution, but the situation changed dramatically in the 4th century. The Emperor Constantine became associated with Christianity after his victory at the Battle of the Milvian Bridge in 312. He later supported Christianity openly. Christianity was no longer simply a minority religion that the state sometimes persecuted. It was becoming part of the imperial order. Constantine also founded a new imperial capital. The city of Byzantium was rebuilt and renamed Constantinople. It stood at the crossroads between Europe and Asia. Its location was extraordinary. It controlled important routes. It was surrounded by water on several sides, and it would become one of the most important cities in the history of the Roman world. The empire was changing again. Rome was still Rome, but its centre of gravity was moving. The old pagan world was changing. The Christian world was growing. The government was becoming more centralised. The army was becoming more professional and more complicated, and the empire was learning how to survive in a new age. The 3rd century crisis had not destroyed Rome. Instead, it had transformed it. But transformation always has a cost, and the empire that emerged from the crisis would be different from the empire that had entered it. The division of the empire and the rise of the East. The Roman Empire had always been difficult to govern as a single unit. Diocletian's reforms recognized this. Later emperors continued to divide responsibilities. Sometimes the empire had one emperor, sometimes it had two, sometimes more. The divisions were usually administrative rather than an admission that there were two completely separate civilizations. People still thought of themselves as Romans. The empire still had one legal tradition. The same imperial idea continued. But gradually, the eastern and western halves developed different personalities. The western half was centred around Italy, Gaul, Spain, North Africa, and Britain. Latin was the dominant language of government and public life. The eastern half included Greece, the Balkans, Asia Minor, Syria, Egypt, and the eastern Mediterranean. Greek culture remained very strong there. The eastern provinces were often richer. They contained large cities and productive agricultural regions. Egypt alone was tremendously valuable. The eastern Mediterranean had long been economically active. Cities such as Antioch and Alexandria were major centres of commerce and culture. Constantinople eventually became the great imperial capital of the East. Rome itself remained symbolically important, but political power increasingly moved elsewhere. This did not mean that Rome suddenly became unimportant. The city still carried immense prestige. Its name was powerful. Its monuments remained. Its traditions remained. Its senate remained for a time. But an emperor who needed to respond quickly to a military crisis could not spend all his time in Rome. The empire's military problems were elsewhere. Emperors therefore spent more time near the frontiers. Milan became important in the west. Ravenna eventually became even more important because it was easier to defend. Constantinople became the great centre of the Eastern Empire. The old image of Rome as the unquestioned centre of everything was fading. And this was one of the most important changes in the story. The Roman Empire did not fall because Rome itself was destroyed. The empire gradually became something larger than the city. Then the city became less central to the empire. This is one of those changes that history often makes quietly. No single moment announces it. A capital changes. A court moves. An emperor spends more time somewhere else. A new city becomes wealthy. And decades later, people look back and realize that the world has changed. The 4th century still contained moments of great strength. Under Constantine, the empire was reunited. Later emperors continued to maintain large armies. Christianity became increasingly important. The imperial government remained powerful. The empire could still defeat major enemies. It could still build enormous monuments. It could still collect taxes from vast territories. But the balance between East and West was becoming clearer. The East was richer. The West had greater military pressures. The western provinces depended heavily on agricultural production. The Western government also faced repeated invasions and civil wars. And there was another important development. The Roman army increasingly relied on soldiers of non-Roman origin. This was not necessarily a sign of collapse. Foreign soldiers had served Rome for centuries. People from many backgrounds could become Roman soldiers. Some became generals, some became officers, some settled in Roman territory after serving. The Roman army had always been flexible about identity. But in the later empire, entire groups could enter Roman territory under treaties. Some were accepted as allies, some received land, some were recruited into Roman armies. This created new relationships between Rome and the peoples beyond its borders. Sometimes the relationships worked, sometimes they did not. The frontier was no longer simply a line separating Romans from outsiders. It was becoming a place where Roman and non-Roman groups lived, traded, fought, served, and settled alongside one another. That would become especially important when the Huns arrived in Europe. The pressure of migrating peoples, Goths, Huns, Vandals, and others. The 4th and 5th centuries are often described through the word invasions. The word is useful, but it can also be misleading. The people who entered the Roman Empire were not always simply armies arriving with the intention of destroying Rome. Many were migrating. Some were fleeing other peoples. Some wanted land. Some wanted safety. Some wanted access to Roman wealth. Some wanted employment in the Roman army. Some wanted political power. Often, several motives existed at once. The Roman frontier was not a wall between two completely different worlds. It was a place of constant interaction. One of the most important peoples in this story were the Goths. The Goths lived north of the Danube and Black Sea regions. Roman writers described them as outsiders, but over time, many Goths became connected to the Roman world. They traded with Romans, they fought Romans, some served in Roman armies, and then, in the late 4th century, something changed. The Huns had arrived from the Eastern European steppe. They moved westward with great speed and military strength. Their arrival put pressure on other peoples. The Goths, among others, found themselves facing a new and dangerous situation. Some Gothic groups crossed the Danube into Roman territory in 376. The Roman government agreed to allow them to settle inside the empire. In theory, this could have worked. The empire had accepted groups before, but Roman officials treated many of the newcomers badly. Food was scarce, prices were high. Local Roman authorities exploited them. The Goths became angry. The situation turned into rebellion. And in 378, the Roman army met the Goths near Adrianople. The Roman Emperor Valens was killed. The Roman army suffered a major defeat. The battle shocked the Roman world. But even then, Rome did not collapse. The empire continued. The Goths eventually reached agreements with the Romans. Some became federated allies. Some served in Roman armies. The empire adapted again. Yet the relationship between Roman government and migrating peoples had become more complicated. In the early 5th century, another Gothic leader, Alaric, became famous. He led Gothic forces through the Balkans and into Greece and Italy. Eventually, in 410, his forces entered Rome. The city was sacked. This event had enormous symbolic importance. Rome had not been captured by a foreign army for centuries. The city that had once conquered much of the Mediterranean was now being entered and looted by outsiders. But the sack of Rome in 410 did not mean the Roman Empire had ended. The Eastern Empire remained strong. The Western Empire remained. Roman armies continued to operate. Roman government continued. The city itself survived. Yet psychologically, the event mattered deeply. It showed that the old world was no longer invulnerable. Then came the Vandals. The Vandals were another Germanic people who moved through Europe and eventually into Roman North Africa. They crossed into Africa in the early 5th century. There, they established a powerful kingdom centered around Carthage. This was particularly serious for the Western Roman Empire. North Africa was one of the richest agricultural regions of the Western Mediterranean. It supplied enormous amounts of grain and other resources. Losing it meant losing revenue. It also meant losing access to an important fleet and strategic position. The Western Empire attempted to recover Africa, but it failed. The Vandal kingdom survived, and in 455, Vandal forces entered Rome and carried out another sack. Again, the city survived. Again, the empire did not instantly disappear. But the Western government was losing important pieces. Britain had already become increasingly difficult for the Roman government to control. Roman authority there faded during the early 5th century. Gaul was increasingly contested. Spain became fragmented. North Africa was lost. Italy remained. But Italy itself was increasingly dependent on military leaders. whose power came from armies made up partly of non-Roman soldiers. The Western emperor was becoming more of a political symbol. Real power often belonged to generals. One of the most important was Flavius Aetius. He was a Roman general who spent much of his career managing relations with various peoples and defending the Western Empire. In 451, he faced Attila the Hun. Attila had built a powerful confederation and invaded Gaul. The Roman government joined forces with Gothic and other allies. The armies met at the Battle of the Catalonian Plains. The battle was hard fought. Attila did not destroy the Roman army. The Roman side survived. Again, Rome had adapted. But the Western Empire was no longer fighting alone. It increasingly depended on alliances with peoples who were themselves outside the traditional Roman system. This was not necessarily weakness in itself. The Roman Empire had always used allies. But now those relationships were becoming essential. After Attila's death, his great confederation quickly weakened. The Huns did not replace the Roman Empire. They did not create a permanent empire in Western Europe. But their arrival had changed the political landscape. They had pushed other peoples westward. They had destabilized existing relationships, and they had accelerated a process already underway. The Roman world was becoming a mixture of Roman and post-Roman societies. The old boundaries were fading. There were still Romans. There were still Roman laws. There were still Roman cities. But new kingdoms were appearing. Gothic kingdoms, Vandal kingdoms, Burgundian kingdoms. Frankish power was growing in Gaul. Visigoths established themselves in parts of Spain and Gaul. Ostrogoths would later establish a kingdom in Italy. The map was changing. And perhaps the most remarkable thing was that many of these new rulers did not think they were completely destroying Rome. They often wanted to inherit Roman civilization. They used Roman titles. They employed Roman officials. They collected taxes in Roman ways. They used Latin. They respected Roman law. They lived among Roman populations. They wanted the prestige of Rome. The Roman world was not simply being replaced, it was being transformed. The key moments of the decline in the West. The 5th century was a time of gradual fragmentation. The Western Roman government still existed. There was still an emperor. There were still Roman armies. There were still taxes. There were still laws. But the Western state was becoming smaller. The loss of North Africa was especially damaging. Without the wealth of Africa, the government had fewer resources. The Western Empire needed money to pay soldiers. It needed money to maintain roads. It needed money to maintain government. But the tax base was shrinking. And when a government loses territory, it does not simply lose land. It loses people. It loses farms, it loses cities, it loses taxes, it loses ports, it loses soldiers, it loses connections. The problem can become cumulative. The Western government also suffered from internal political struggles. Emperors were often placed on the throne and then removed. Generals competed for power. Some emperors were children. Others were military figures with little independent authority. The imperial court moved between cities. Ravenna became the main Western imperial residence. It was a strange symbol of the changing world. Rome was still the most famous city in the West, but the emperor preferred a smaller, better defended city. The Western emperor was no longer ruling from the traditional heart of Roman political life. And then there was the problem of military leadership. Generals such as Stilicho, Aetius, Ricimer, and others became extremely powerful. They could influence who became emperor. They could control armies. They could negotiate with Germanic leaders. The emperor increasingly depended on the general. And when a ruler depends on someone who commands the army, the political balance becomes delicate. In 454, the Emperor Valentinian III killed Aetius. Only a short time later, Valentinian himself was assassinated. The Western government entered another period of instability. The Vandals attacked Rome in 455. The Emperor Petronius Maximus was killed. Other emperors followed. Some ruled for months, some ruled for weeks. The imperial throne became increasingly unstable. The Western Empire still had capable people. It still had resources. It still had Roman cities. But the central government was losing the ability to coordinate everything. This is where the word decline becomes useful. Decline does not mean that everything becomes worse every day. It means that the overall ability of a system to maintain its previous level of power becomes weaker. There were still victories. There were still prosperous regions. There were still functioning governments. There were still wealthy families. There were still Roman traditions. But the direction had changed. The Western Empire was no longer expanding, it was trying to survive. And survival is different from expansion. The last decades were filled with compromises. Roman authorities made agreements with Gothic leaders. They recognized new kingdoms. They hired foreign troops. They tried to preserve what remained. The empire became increasingly regional. Local rulers mattered more. Cities became more independent. The countryside became more important. Roman administration continued, but unevenly. In some places, Roman institutions remained surprisingly strong. In others, they faded quickly. And this helps explain why the fall of the Western Roman Empire did not feel like one great disaster to everyone. For someone living in northern Gaul, the fall of the Western Emperor might have seemed distant. For someone living in Italy, it might have mattered more. For someone in Egypt or Constantinople, the Western Emperor could have been a political figure far away. For a farmer, the greatest concern might simply have been the harvest. For a merchant, it might have been whether the road was safe. For a local bishop, it might have been whether the town had enough food. History often remembers emperors. Ordinary people remember whether life was peaceful. The two experiences are not always the same. By the later 5th century, many people living in former Roman territories continued to live lives that looked remarkably Roman. They spoke Latin. They used Roman laws. They lived in Roman cities. They attended Christian churches. They used Roman roads. They paid taxes to new rulers who sometimes claimed to govern according to Roman traditions. The political structure was changing faster than everyday culture. This is why 476 is both important and misleading. It is important because a Roman emperor in the West was finally removed and not replaced by another Western Roman emperor, but it is misleading if people imagine that the entire Roman world disappeared that year. It did not. The Eastern Empire continued. Roman law continued. Roman Christianity continued. Roman cities continued. Roman culture continued. The Mediterranean world continued. Only one particular political structure had finally reached its end, and that brings the story to 476. The fall of Rome. In 476. What really happened? The year 476 has become one of the most famous dates in world history. It is often described as the year when the Roman Empire fell. But what happened was actually much quieter than the phrase suggests. There was no giant final battle. There was no enormous fire consuming Rome. There was no single moment when everyone suddenly realized that the Roman Empire was gone. Instead, there was a political change. The Western Emperor was a young man named Romulus Augustulus. His name was almost symbolic. Romulus was the legendary founder of Rome. Augustus was the name of the first Roman emperor, and now, in the 5th century, a young ruler carried both names. He was not especially powerful. Real authority belonged largely to military leaders. One of those leaders was Odoacer. Odoacer was a military commander whose troops included soldiers from several different Germanic backgrounds. In 476, Odoacer rebelled. Romulus Augustulus was removed from power. He was not killed. He was sent into retirement. Odoacer then did something that was politically significant. He did not appoint another Western emperor. Instead, he recognized the Eastern emperor, Zeno, as the legitimate Roman emperor. Odoacer ruled Italy as a king while formally acknowledging the authority of the Eastern Roman emperor. From one perspective, the Western Empire had ended. There was no longer a separate Western emperor. From another perspective, Roman imperial authority had not completely disappeared. The Eastern emperor still claimed to rule the Roman Empire, and that empire would survive for centuries. This is why the date 476 needs to be handled carefully. If someone had stood in Italy in the year 477, they might not have thought that the ancient world had suddenly ended. The Senate still existed in Rome. Roman laws still existed. The Latin language was still used. Christian churches were still there. Roman buildings still stood. People still called themselves Romans. The government had simply changed. A new king now ruled Italy. This was part of a much longer transformation. The Western Roman Empire had been losing territory for decades. Its government had been weakening. Its emperors had become increasingly dependent on generals. Its tax base had shrunk. Its military structure had changed. Its provinces had become more independent. The events of 476 were therefore more like the final page of a book whose ending had been approaching for a long time. Even the idea of Rome falling is complicated by geography. The city of Rome had already stopped being the main political capital of the West. Ravenna was the imperial residence. The Eastern Empire had its capital at Constantinople. So the fall of the Western Emperor was not the destruction of the Roman civilization, it was the end of the Western imperial office. That is a smaller event than the phrase "fall of Rome" sometimes suggests. And yet, it was still deeply important. For hundreds of years, the Western Mediterranean had been organized around Roman imperial power. Now that system was gone. New kingdoms emerged. The Franks became powerful in Gaul. The Visigoths controlled much of Spain. The Ostrogoths later ruled Italy. The Vandals controlled North Africa. Britain developed into a collection of smaller kingdoms. The old Roman provinces became the foundations for new political worlds. The Roman Empire was disappearing in the West, but Rome itself was not disappearing. Its language survived, its law survived, its religion survived, its architecture survived, its roads survived, its cities survived, its memory survived. Perhaps the most remarkable survival was the idea of Rome itself. New rulers wanted to be connected to it. They wanted Roman legitimacy. They wanted Roman administrators. They wanted Roman culture. Even when the imperial government was gone, the prestige of Rome remained. That is why 476 should be imagined not as a door slamming shut, but as a doorway. On one side was the ancient Roman imperial world. On the other side was a collection of medieval kingdoms, and people walked through that doorway gradually. Some were Roman, some were Goths, some were Franks, some were Vandals, many were Christian. Almost all of them inherited something from the world that came before. The old world had not vanished, it had become something new. What remained afterward? the Roman legacy and why the fall was not a sudden end. After the Western imperial government disappeared, the Roman world continued in many different forms. The most obvious continuation was the Eastern Roman Empire. It is often called the Byzantine Empire today, but the people who lived there did not normally think of themselves as Byzantines. They thought of themselves as Romans. Their emperor was the Roman emperor. Their capital was Constantinople. Their laws descended from Roman law. Their government was Roman. Their army was Roman. Their Christian faith became central to their identity. And this Eastern Roman Empire continued for nearly another 1,000 years. Its history was enormous. It survived invasions. It survived civil wars. It lost territories. It recovered territories. It faced Persians. It faced Arab armies. It faced Slavic peoples. It faced Crusaders. It faced Turks. It changed languages and traditions over time, yet it remained Roman until Constantinople finally fell in 1453. So in one sense, the Roman Empire did not truly disappear in 476. Only the western half of the imperial system ended. The eastern half continued. But the Roman legacy also survived outside the empire. One of the most important legacies was law. Roman legal ideas influenced European legal systems for centuries. The concept of citizenship, the organization of contracts, property law, court procedures, ideas about public authority. Many of these traditions survived in different forms. The Latin language also survived. Latin eventually developed into the Romance languages: Italian, French, Spanish, Portuguese, Romanian, and others. The languages spoken by millions of people today carry traces of a language once spoken by Roman soldiers, merchants, farmers, officials, and writers. Romanian is particularly interesting because it developed in southeastern Europe, far from the political centre of the later Western Empire. Its survival reminds the modern world that language does not always follow political borders. A political empire can disappear. A language can remain. Roman roads also left their mark. Not every modern road follows a Roman road, but many routes in Europe developed around ancient networks. Cities also continued: London, Paris, Vienna, Cologne, Milan, Florence, Barcelona. And many others have histories connected to the Roman world. Sometimes the Roman city survived almost continuously. Sometimes it shrank. Sometimes it was rebuilt. Sometimes its stones were reused. A Roman building might become a church. A Roman wall might become the foundation of a medieval fortification. A Roman road might become the route of a later road. The physical world of Rome remained beneath the New World. Religion was another major legacy. Christianity became deeply connected to Roman institutions during the late Empire. After the Western imperial government disappeared, the church became one of the major institutions capable of preserving literacy, administration, education, and social organization. In Western Europe, bishops often became important local figures. Monasteries preserved texts. Latin remained a language of learning. Christian communities continued many Roman traditions. The church itself had inherited a great deal from the Roman administrative world. Even the organization of Christian communities reflected the structure of cities and provinces. The memory of Rome also became powerful. Medieval rulers often wanted to claim some connection to Roman authority. Charlemagne, centuries later, would be crowned emperor in the West. The Holy Roman Empire would use the Roman name. Russian rulers would later imagine Moscow as a successor to Constantinople. European political thinkers continued to study Roman history. The Roman Republic became a model for later political ideas. Roman architecture influenced later buildings. Roman engineering influenced later builders. Roman literature became part of European education. Roman history became a way for later societies to think about power. And perhaps most importantly, the story of Rome became a lesson about impermanence. The empire that seemed enormous eventually became smaller. The city that once ruled the Mediterranean eventually became one city among many. The roads remained. The stones remained. The language remained. The stories remained. But the political structure was gone. This is why the phrase "fall of Rome" can sometimes hide the real historical process. The end was not complete. The Roman world was not erased. Instead, it was broken into pieces and carried forward. A law here, a language there, a road beneath a modern street, a church built beside an old forum, a word in a modern language, a political idea, a piece of architecture, a story about an emperor, a fragment of an ancient manuscript. The Roman Empire became less like a single country and more like a memory spread across many cultures. And perhaps that is what civilizations often become. They do not simply vanish. They become ingredients. They become foundations. They become habits. They become words. They become ruins. They become stories told quietly at night. The long evening of Rome. It can be tempting to imagine Rome as a great civilization that was once brilliant and then became weak. But the reality was more complicated. Rome remained impressive for a very long time. The later empire still produced great buildings. Its armies still fought effectively. Its government still collected taxes. Its scholars still wrote books. Its cities still functioned. Its Christian communities became increasingly organized. Its eastern provinces remained wealthy. The 5th century West was not simply a wasteland. There were still farms. There were still markets. There were still wealthy landowners. There were still craftsmen. There were still schools. There were still people who admired classical literature. The world was changing, but people were still living. This matters because history can sometimes make decline sound like darkness. Real life is rarely that simple. A society can experience political decline while individuals experience ordinary happiness. A child can be born during the final century of an empire and have a loving childhood. A family can celebrate a wedding while armies are moving somewhere far away. A farmer can have a good harvest during a year when a government is struggling. A merchant can make a profit while a dynasty is collapsing. The fall of an empire is experienced differently by different people. For some, it is war. For others, it is a new tax collector. For others, it is simply a new name on a coin. And for many, it may be almost invisible. That is one of the reasons the fall of Rome took so long. There was no reason for ordinary life to stop simply because political structures were changing. People adapted, they always do. The Roman Empire itself had survived because people adapted. The late Roman world survived because people adapted again. New rulers adopted Roman customs. Roman populations adopted new rulers. Christianity changed the culture. Languages evolved. Cities changed. Trade routes changed. The old world became the new world. And perhaps the most peaceful way to think about the fall of Rome is not as destruction, but as transformation. A tree does not need to disappear completely for a forest to change. Old branches fall. New branches grow. The shape becomes different. The material remains. Rome was much the same. The end. A quiet reflection. And now, after travelling across so many centuries, the story can begin to slow down. The Roman Empire has been followed from its height to its gradual transformation. There were emperors who believed they would preserve it forever. There were soldiers who guarded distant borders. There were merchants crossing the Mediterranean. There were farmers working beneath the sun. There were children growing up in cities filled with Roman buildings. There were travellers walking along roads that had been built long before they were born. There were people who believed that Rome would always exist. And then, slowly, the world changed. Not in one moment, not in one great explosion, but little by little, a province was lost, a border became harder to defend, a city became less important, a new emperor took power, a different army crossed a river, a tax became heavier, a road became less safe, a kingdom appeared where a province had once been, and eventually the Western emperor was gone. Yet Rome was not entirely gone. The stones remained, the roads remained, the laws remained, the language remained, the faith remained, the stories remained. And somewhere far to the east, in Constantinople, Roman emperors continued to rule. That is perhaps the gentlest lesson in the entire story. Nothing remains exactly as it was. Not empires, not cities, not kingdoms, not even the shape of the land beneath our feet. Time changes everything, but change does not always mean disappearance. Sometimes it means transformation. Rome became something else. The Roman world became many worlds, and those worlds eventually became the societies that would shape medieval and modern Europe. So perhaps, when thinking about the fall of Rome, there is no need to imagine only ruins. There can also be imagined roads. A Roman road beneath the moon, an old stone bridge crossing a quiet river, a field where a farmer once worked, a distant city glowing with lamps, a ship moving slowly across the Mediterranean, a manuscript being copied by candlelight, a church built from stones that once belonged to a Roman building, a word that survives in a modern language, a modern city standing where a Roman city once stood. The past is still there, not exactly as it was, but in pieces, in memories, in architecture, in language, in ideas, and perhaps that is enough. Final, very quietly. The story of Rome can now rest. The armies have gone, the emperors are gone, the great political struggles have become distant, the roads are quiet, the forums are silent, the old ships have disappeared beneath the centuries, the voices of ancient people have faded, but the night remains. The same stars that once shone above Roman soldiers still shine above the world today. The same moon that once appeared above the walls of Rome still rises quietly. People have always looked upward at the night. Roman people did. Medieval people did. People do now. And for a moment across all those centuries there is something familiar. The world changes. People come and go. Cities rise. Cities fall. Empires appear. Empires disappear. But the night remains peaceful. So there is no need to hold on to the details anymore. The dates can fade. The names can fade. The battles can become distant. The maps can disappear. The story has been told. Rome had its morning, Rome had its afternoon, and eventually Rome had its evening. But an evening is not necessarily something sad. An evening can be quiet, it can be gentle, it can be beautiful, it can simply mean that the day is finished, and perhaps that is how the Roman world can be remembered tonight. Not as a sudden disaster, not as a single terrible ending, but as a long evening, a civilization that had travelled a very great distance, a civilization that had built roads and cities, laws and bridges, ports and aqueducts, a civilization that had known war and peace, prosperity and hardship, confidence and uncertainty, a civilization that changed the world, and then, slowly, changed into something else. The final emperor of the Western Empire did not stand at the edge of the world and watch everything disappear. He simply lost his throne. The people continued living. The seasons continued changing. The fields continued growing. The sea continued moving against the shores. And somewhere, perhaps, an ordinary person went to sleep that night without knowing that historians would later choose that year as a boundary between two ages. That is how quietly history sometimes turns. One day becomes another. One ruler becomes another. One world slowly becomes another, and life continues. So now the story can become quieter. The Roman roads can grow distant. The walls can fade into darkness. The great cities can disappear behind the horizon. The Mediterranean can become still. The last sounds of the ancient world can fade gently away. There's nothing more that needs to be followed. Nothing more that needs to be remembered tonight. The empire has reached the end of its journey, and the listener can simply rest. The room can be quiet. The breathing can become slow. The thoughts can become softer. There is no need to solve anything. No need to understand everything. The centuries have already passed. The emperors have already slept. The armies have already gone home or disappeared into history. The old roads no longer need to be walked. The old cities no longer need to be watched. Everything can be allowed to become distant. Far away, beyond the darkness of the present, Rome is only a memory now, a memory made of stone and dust, of roads and rivers, of languages and stories, of people who lived ordinary lives beneath an enormous empire. And perhaps that is the most beautiful part of remembering history. Behind every emperor were ordinary people. People who woke up in the morning, people who worked, people who ate, people who worried, people who laughed, people who loved their families, people who grew old, people who went to sleep. They did not know how history would remember them. They simply lived. And now their world is quiet. So the story can end there, quietly, without a final battle, without a dramatic ending, just the slow fading of an ancient world. The sun has gone down over Rome. The streets are empty. The stones have cooled. The sea is dark. The stars are above the old empire, and everything is still. The Roman Empire has become part of the past, and the past can rest. The present can rest too. The night is here. The day is finished. There is nothing else that needs to be done. The story is over, and now, slowly, peacefully, it is time to sleep. Good night, and let the ancient world grow quiet. Good night.